I don't think I formally asked you, are there any witnesses for the defense?
No, Your Honor, I did discuss this again with my client, and he did, and I advised him of his absolute right to testify on his own behalf or to remain silent, and at this time, I will not be calling him or anyone else.
Not even the father himself. Bold move. Sometimes silence can protect a client from cross-examination, but it also leaves the judge with unanswered questions. Risky strategy or smart restraint? You decide.
Yes.
Very good. Closing arguments.
Your Honor, viewing the evidence in light most favorable to the people, the people do believe we've sustained our burden and ask to return a verdict on single count of child abuse. Otherwise, I will rest on the proofs. Thank you, Your Honor.
Closing.
Thank you, Your Honor. So we're here today because of a father setting some ground rules for some of his teenage children and trying to enforce them. We've all here been teenagers before, myself not too long ago, if dare I say it, and we've all had arguments with our parents.
You're saying that's in the...
Pardon me, Your Honor?
You're saying that because why? You want to compare that to when I was last a teenager?
Probably.
Never mind this fake, go on.
And so, as Your Honor was also a teenager not too long ago as well. Maybe even at the same time, but I do not know that. I've had arguments with my parents over rules they've set over the years. I believe many people, it's a common human experience. We've heard the testimony today that Ms. Bullard wanted her TV back, and my client I'm not going to comment on anyone's parenting, whether or not a teenager has a right to a TV, whether they do not, whether they have a right to go to their friends or not. My client was just setting some ground rules for his minor children that they happen to disagree with. They did have a verbal argument. And I will agree that they did have a verbal argument that day regarding the rules. However, my client never intentionally laid his hands on Ms. Bullard in any way. We did hear the testimony, and Ms. Bullard testified to the fact that Mr. Bullard grabbed her arms. I am not stating that that happened or did not. What I will say is that she did not at any point testify that Mr. Bullard touched her neck in any way. She did not testify that he grabbed her neck, that he tried to grab her neck, that he touched it, even in passing. There was no testimony or evidence presented that he purposely ripped on her neck. Candidly, because we did see a photo of a scratch on Ms. Bullard's neck, I will acquiesce that she had one on that day in that picture.
Boom! Reasonable doubt alert. The defense is planting seeds. If the scratch's origin isn't crystal clear, how can the prosecution prove abuse beyond a reasonable doubt? Classic defense move. Turn one photo into a question mark instead of a smoking gun.
Was taken by the police. We don't know how we got it, or how she got it. Candidly, I don't know how grabbing the arms could lead to that scratch on the neck. My client is not guilty of this offense of child abuse in the 4th degree. He is the parent or guardian of Miss Asia Bullard. He did have care custody of her that day. He did not knowing intentionally harm her, injure her, or put her in a position where at which she could be harmed. They did have a verbal argument. She was angry about that. When she talked to her older brother later that day, as Ms. Bullard testified, he encouraged her to call the police, which is what she did. And Mr. Bullard was not there at that time. We don't know what investigation the police did to get his side of the story. That was not presented today. I'm asking the court to return a verdict of not guilty, as people have failed to meet their burden that my client intentionally harmed Ms. Bullard in any way or caused that injury to her neck. Thank you, Your Honor.
And just briefly in rebuttal, one thing, I do think that Miss Asia did say that the defendant scratched her as seen in Exhibit 3, and I do ask the court to return the verdict of guilty. Thank you.
In this case, and I will refer to her as Asia because that's how she wanted me to be referred to. I listened very closely to her testimony in this case. Surprisingly, well, I won't say surprising. She was very candid in her answers. I'm not sure entirely. Also, as I'm looking at her and listening to her testify, I feel bad for her. And I feel bad for her because, quite frankly, I think I haven't heard from Mr. Bullard, or I haven't heard from Mom either. But I think both of them are failing her.
Oof. That's not legal commentary, that's parental commentary. The judge just shifted from law to life. And trust me, when a judge tells you you're failing your child, it hits harder than any gavel strike.
And I say that because I think it's an interesting thing about kids. All they want to do is be loved. That's really all they want. And I think she's, frankly, as I understand the circumstance, being forced into a circumstance to choose sides, and she doesn't know why. Some of the unfairness that she talks about is that there's that unfairness of the some young man who is just a friend, and I can only imagine what that's all about. Probably not necessarily the reality from either perspective, but dads sometimes react that way with their daughters. Young lady, one thing that you're going to have to kind of get used to regarding anyone that you bring into your life is, and I'm sure it's going to happen, the same thing with Mom. You're going to see them. They're going to see them. They're going to make an immediate assessment. And then that's where it is. They're going to have to either prove themselves worthy or not. It's just life. But on this day, and I asked some very specific questions of Asia, and I do appreciate her honest answers and appreciate at the end that she didn't hate her father. There are probably things that are going on in that household, things in the world she doesn't quite understand. You know, she's only 16, so the only world she experiences is what's around her. Sometimes also the argument that parents and kids are having isn't really about what it is that sometimes happens with all human beings. It's probably about something much deeper. But as you listen to Asia, she was talking. Dad says X. She wants something else to happen. They begin yelling at each other. And as they begin yelling at each other, it begins to just sort of escalate. Asia said it best herself. When I asked, do you think your dad was trying to hurt you? And she said that he wasn't, that they were yelling at each other. But the one thing that she then pointed out was it got to where it got to.
A showdown at the doorway. This is the courtroom equivalent of a Western standoff. But instead of guns, it's pride, parenting, and teenage defiance on the line. And sometimes those battles leave scars deeper than physical scratches.
It almost becomes this showdown at the door with both sides not wanting the other to win or leave with the upper hand. When you have a child that is trying to say something, whether screaming, yelling, doing whatever, because I guess the big people in the room, one has to sort of step back, kind of realize, or kind of try to figure out what it's all about. Dad said something that was interesting, but that wasn't satisfactory to Asia, especially about the boy and about everything else. that he was going to come back. He was going to see his mother. He was going to come back and he was going to talk to her. On the surface, that seems kind of reasonable. And I guess if one were second guessing, maybe there should have been a great pause and saying, maybe I need to talk with you now instead of going. Because maybe that's what my child needs. I'm not going to sit there and second guess it. There. But sometimes that's what has to happen. I also don't think, well, Asia did what she did. I don't think really Asia relished the fact of having to sit here and try to testify against her dad. I don't think she liked it. I don't think she should, where one can help but be there in that circumstance. Say this. I'll say it may be inappropriate. Mom and Dad, you got to do better. You just have to do better. You have a wonderful, beautiful daughter that was up here testifying, and the two of you have to do better. She should never think, either because it's true or either because it's something placed in her head, that the reason Dad is so hard on me is because I'm like Mom. First of all, I've never seen a child that is just one parent. Never seen it in my life, and doubt I ever will. They're part of both of you. And both of you need to acknowledge that she has those parts. Part of that yelling going back and forth between daughter and dad was because they probably are a lot more alike than they want to even acknowledge at times. She was going to try to give as good as she was trying to give, and that was just going to go, and then it was a point at which who's going to win or try to win. You guys have to do better. If it's true that Dad treats her a certain way because you're like Mom, well, then that's something Dad has to get over and realize that's his little girl regardless. If that's not the case, but something being planted because of the dysfunctional dynamic that may be going on in that home planted in her head by Mom, then Mom, you have to let that go. You two don't have to like each other, but you gotta love that little girl. Both of you. Proved this charge of child abuse 4th degree, and I'll just skip to the elements. Clearly had custody or control. But the defendant knowingly or intentionally committed an act that under the circumstances posed an unreasonable risk of harm to the child, or did something in a reckless fashion that caused that to the child. I don't believe that people have sustained their burden of showing that by any stretch of the imagination. I don't believe that, based upon the testimony before me, that the defendant's conduct was by any means reckless. And by her own testimony, she admitted that the acts in and of themselves were intentional in terms of what was going on. Now, to the extent also that one might believe that they were intentional acts, the concept of parental discipline, that parents are certainly allowed to discipline their children within reasonable limits. Given the circumstances as described by Asia, the force on the door, I noticed that while there may have been a mark to the neck, I'm not thoroughly convinced that that came from the actions of Dad, and certainly not any intentional act. The one thing that was missing, which would have seemed to have been there had he been in just this rage of anger, would have certainly been marks to her arms. have no proof of that because she's very clear that he grabbed her arm. And if that was his first grab, there was certainly would have been marks, bruises, something there when the police arrived. Given all of the circumstances and the totality of the circumstances, it's not up to the defendant to prove that his acts were reasonable, but more for the people to show that his acts were not reasonable. The people have not met their burden in that respect regarding the actions of the defendant on that day, ultimately ending up at the door. Asia's pushing on one side, Dad's pushing on another side of the door. I think that there might be differences in that, but it certainly wasn't shown to the court that this was not an exercise in a certain respect of parental discipline with no intent by her own statement that this defendant was intending to harm. And so for those reasons, the court would find that the people have not sustained their burden, find a defendant.
And there it is, the verdict, not guilty. But notice the nuance. The judge isn't saying this family is fine. He's saying the law can't prove abuse here. Big difference. Legal innocence doesn't always equal family harmony.
Not guilty of count one, child abuse and forgery.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Asia, do me a favor. Take care of yourself, young lady.